All right, so let's talk a little bit about the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system links the central nervous system to the body and to the external environment. The peripheral nervous system detects sensory stimuli and delivers that information to the central nervous system as what we refer to as sensory input. The CNS, or the central nervous system, then processes that input, transmits an impulse through the peripheral nervous system to muscle cells or glands, and that is referred to as motor output. So you have sensory input, motor output. The sensory division, also known as the afferent division, consists of the sensory neurons. These are the neurons that detect and transmit sensory stimuli to the central nervous system, and it has a couple of different anatomical divisions. You have the somatic sensory division and the visceral sensory division. And if you kind of remember, when we talk about somatic, we're usually talking about things that have to do with the muscles, the organs, and those kinds of things, or some special sense organs. The visceral tends to be more of the abdominal pelvic organs. So the somatosensory division detects both internal and external stimuli. Uh, General sense receptors detect stimuli from the skin. Special sensor receptors detect stimuli from the special sense organs. Again, we talked about those special sense organs in the last chapter. Taste, smell, sight, hearing, those things. Visceral sensory division relays information internally, such as blood pressure, from the organs of the abdominal, pelvic, and thoracic cavities. The motor division are the efferent neurons. They carry out the motor functions of the nervous system. It also has two subdivisions, the somatic and visceral motor divisions. The somatic motor division is for voluntary motor functions. These use those lower motor neurons that trigger muscle contractions directly. The visceral motor division, again, talking more along the lines of our organ systems. The visceral motor division maintains the aspects of homeostasis by controlling involuntary muscle functions of the body. So the somatic division, voluntary motor functions; visceral motor division, involuntary motor functions. The neurons of the visceral system innervate cardiac muscle cells, smooth muscle cells, and those secretory cells in the glands, like the sweat glands and the salivary glands in your mouth. Uh, the motor division of the autonomic nervous system is further divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. The sympathetic division uh, is responsible for homeostasis activities surrounding physical work and visceral responses such as emotions. The parasympathetic division is responsible for digestion and maintaining the body's homeostasis at rest. The sympathetic division is what is referred to as the fight or flight system, or the fight or flight division. These are the things that are going to, in times of toil, in times of trauma, in times of fear, these are the things that are going to accelerate your heart rate, accelerate your respiration rate, accelerate your blood pressure, or elevate your blood pressure. Whereas the parasympathetic division is called the rest and digest division. This is the part that's going to slow all those things down as you're sitting down after you've had Thanksgiving dinner and you're watching the football game. Your parasympathetic takes over and your heart rate goes down a little bit. Your blood pressure goes down a little bit. Your respiration goes down a little bit because you are under the control then of the parasympathetic division. So you have the peripheral, here's the central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, sending out its signals. Here's the eye, so the somatic sensory, so the eyes, the skin for touch, general sensation. Visceral sensory system, urinary bladder stretches telling you that you need to go empty the bladder or you're going to have an accident. Then we have the somatic motor division, the skeletal muscles, the motor neurons, and then we have the visceral motor division, controlling, again, heart rate, and some more things to do with the urinary bladder. The peripheral nerves are the main organs of the peripheral nervous system. They are axons of many neurons bound together by connective tissue. Nerves of the peripheral nervous system contact, and the word we use for that is innervate the majority of the structures in the body. The mixed nerves contain sensory and motor neurons. Sensory nerves contain only sensory neurons, whereas motor nerves contain mostly motor neurons. There are some sensory neurons involved in muscle stretch and tension. So motor nerves will have some sensory neurons. Sensory nerves contain only sensory neurons. And then the mixed nerves contain about equal amounts of both sensory and motor neurons. Your spinal nerves, these are the nerves that originate from the spinal cord. They innervate structures below the head and neck. These anatomical structures are associated with the groups, which include two collections of axons connecting the peripheral nervous system with the spinal cord's gray matter. You have the anterior motor root, which are motor neurons from the anterior horn, and you have the posterior sensory root, which has sensory neurons from the posterior horn. Spinal nerves have a posterior root ganglion. It's referred to as the dorsal root ganglion, just another term for it. It is a swollen area on the posterior root. It houses cell bodies of sensory neurons. The posterior and anterior roots fuse to form the spinal nerve, just lateral to the posterior root ganglion. You have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they are all mixed nerves. And there is an example of a spinal nerve and the way it is connected to the spinal cord. Here is the anterior root. It comes to the front. There's the posterior root. There's the posterior root ganglion. And here, where it all comes together, we have the spinal nerve. And then there is the axon of a single neuron. The epineurium is the outermost layer of the connective tissue. It holds the motor and sensory axons together. Just like when we talked about muscle, if you remember, we had the perimysium and the endomysium when we had muscles. So here we have the epineurium, is the outermost layer, again, composed of connective tissue. We have fascicles, which are small groups of axons surrounded by a connective tissue called the perineurium. And the endoneurium is the tissue that connects and surrounds all the different fascicles to hold everything together into one nerve unit. There's a cross section using a scanning electron microscope, magnified. And when you see 20, when you're talking about a scanning electron microscope, they're not talking about magnified 20 times. They're talking about magnified 20,000 times. Here's another drawing to show you what you're actually seeing up here. But here's the epineurium surrounding this entire structure. There's the fascicle forming right here. There's a sort of extension of the fascicle. There are the myelinated and unmyelinated axons, and the endoneurium surrounding each of those individual axons. Cranial nerves attached to the brain. They are mostly innervated. They mostly innervate structures in the head and neck. They are not formed by the fusion of sensory and motor nerves like the spinal nerves. Cranial nerves are either going to be sensory, mixed, or motor. The functions of the peripheral nervous system: the sensory neurons detect stimuli at the sensory receptors, after which the following events occur. The stimuli is transmitted along the sensory neuron to the cerebral cortex. In the cortex, that information is interpreted, integrated, and the appropriate motor response is selected and initiated. That initiated motor response then travels to the spinal cord. Neurons synapse with lower motor neurons of the peripheral nervous system. Those lower motor neurons carry the impulses to the appropriate muscles, either via cranial or spinal nerves, and they trigger muscle contractions and whatever the appropriate response to the original stimuli happens. Let's stop right there for this one, and I want to do the cranial nerves as its own little video, so we will talk about the cranial nerves later.